So far in our Vue applications, we've not really worked properly with forms and capturing form data that a user might type into them. Now, Vue makes it really simple to work with forms so that we can keep track of what a user does type into these different fields or what they select from drop-downs, etc. And I'm going to show you how Vue handles all of these different inputs and fields so that when we submit the form at the bottom, we can easily get access to all of that data. In our case, we're probably just going to log it to the console, but later in the course, we'll do things like save it to a database. For now, let's just create a new Vue project to do this. So to do that, open up a terminal, navigate to where you want to create the project and type Vue create, and we'll call this web-form like so. Press enter and that's going to ask us a few different questions. We want to manually select features, enter, and we're going to press space on the linter and then press enter again. We'll choose version 3 and we want the config for Babel in a dedicated config file, and we don't want to save that preset. Press enter and it's going to create that project for us. Once it's done, we want to cd into the new project directory, which is web-form, and then I can say code full stop, press enter, and that's going to open up in Visual Studio Code. Alright then, to begin with, we'll just set out the basic structure of the application. So go to source and we'll open up components, delete hello world, we don't want that. And inside the app.vue, let's get rid of this import at the top and bring that up. Get rid of hello world and the image as well. And we can get rid of hello world inside the components there. And what I'd like to do is, first of all, just add a bit of style at the bottom for the body. So I'm going to say body, and then inside margin is 0 to strip away that margin and give this a background of EEE like so. And oops, we need 3 E's, which is a light gray, and that's pretty much all I want to do. I also want to create a component for the sign up form, so let's do that. New file and call this sign up form.vue. Then inside here, I'm going to type in Vue and enter for the first option to get that boilerplate. And inside the template, I want a simple form. We don't need the action because we'll be using JavaScript to handle the submission. Inside, all I'm going to do for now is one label and one input. So we'll do a label, and we don't need 4 right here. I'll get rid of that. And inside, we'll say this is for the email field. We also need an input, and the type is going to be email, and this is a required field. Okay, so I also want to just do a few styles, and I'm going to paste those in at the bottom so you don't have to watch me type them out. And all we have is the form right here. We give this a max width of 420 pixels, margin top and bottom of 30 pixels, auto left and right so it sits centrally on the page. The background of the form is white, text align inside is left, bit of padding and bit of border radius. The label is going to be a grey colour. We display it as inline block so we can give it some padding and margin, or rather just margin, which is this. The font size is reduced 0.6 ems, uppercase for the text, letter spacing 1 pixels and a font weight of bold. Then the input itself, display block, bit of padding, a width of 100%, box sizing border box, meaning the sizing takes into consideration the padding and the border into its overall width. And then the border is 0. And the border bottom is 1 pixel solid and this light grey colour. The colour of the text is 555, which is a darker grey colour. And by the way, the reason I don't type all these out from scratch is that I'm assuming you already know a little bit about CSS, and this is not a CSS course. I'm sure you don't want me to explain absolutely everything I'm doing with CSS. If you do want to learn about CSS, I've got loads of free tutorials on my YouTube channel if you want to check those out. But anyway, let us now save this, and I'm going to open up a terminal and I want to run this using npm run serve so we can preview it in a browser, and that should hopefully give us the link we need to click in a second. Oh, before I do that, by the way, I want to nest this component, this sign up form, in the app component over here. So let's first import it. I'm going to say import sign up form, and it's from / the same directory, then into components, and then we want the sign up form.vue, and then we can register it right here, sign up form. You should know what I'm doing here. We've done all of this before, and I'm going to now use the sign up form right here. Okay, so now if we open this up in a browser, I'm going to bring this in from my other screen, and this is what it looks like so far. So very simple to begin with, but that's our basic setup. And next I'm going to talk about how we can track what a user types into this input field using two-way data binding. So the easiest way to track what a user types into an input field, much like this one here, or select from a drop-down box, is to use what's known as vModel. And vModel is just another Vue directive, and it allows us to sync a form field like this with some component data in a way that gives us something known as two-way data binding. And we're going to talk about what that means later on. But for now, let's take a look at how this works. So I'm going to head to the sign-up form components, and I want to create a bit of data so that I can store in it what a user types in here. So first of all, we need our data function, which returns an object, and I'm going to create a property in this called email, and to begin with that will be an empty string. Now what I'd like is that when a user types in this input field, this gets updated with the value that they type in. So if they type in A, then this updates to keep track of that value with the value A, like so. So I want to kind of sync these two together, and as they type, it updates. So ABC, and it becomes ABC every time they type in a new key. So the best way to do this, and the easiest way to do this, is by using that directive vModel. And all I have to do is come to the input and say v-model and set it equal to whatever data property that I want to use to track this input. So in our case, it's this, email. So let's say email. All right. Now you don't have to call this email. You can call it what you want. Just makes sense to me since we're tracking an email to call it email. Now let's do another one. I'm going to copy those two and change this to password. And then I'm going to change the type to password, and I'm going to change vModel to password. That means I have to create a password property over here. And to begin with, that will be a blank string. So as I type into this field now, then it's going to update this property so that we're tracking both of these different fields now, and we're storing those values. And then later on, when we go to submit the form, we have those values readily available in these data properties, which is nice. So let me now do something with these, because at the minute, although we're tracking them over here, nothing's happening. We're not doing anything with them. So let's now maybe output them at the bottom so we can see that we are tracking them. So underneath these two, I'm going to do a paragraph tag, and I will say, in fact, we'll do this outside of the form at the bottom. So we'll do a paragraph tag first and say the email, and that is going to be the email property that we have right here. And then we'll do the same thing for the password. So password is going to be password. All right, so let's give this a whirl. I'm going to save it and come over here, and you can see already, without typing it, they have already tracked what's currently in these different fields. Let me refresh. You can see that to begin with, they are empty strings. And if I type in like Mario, you can see updating at the bottom. And if I go to password, test 1, 2, 3, you can see that updating at the bottom as well. So we can see that we have these two properties tracking these two fields. And that was really simple. All we had to do was use the vModel directive and say what property we want to store this value in. Dead simple. So that's how this vModel directive works. But what does that term two-way data binding mean that I mentioned earlier? Well, it means that values are bound two ways between the template inputs here and the component data itself. So if the value updates from input by the user, we bind that update to the component data. So the component data updates, that would be one-way data binding from the input to the component data. But we also bind it the other way. So if I updated the value from our component inside a method or something like that, it would also update what we see inside the input field and anywhere else in the template that we output it, like down here as well. So we bind the data both ways. That's called two-way data binding. From the inputs to the data properties, and then from here to the template as well. And this is what vModel does for us behind the scenes. It binds the data in both directions. So let me just demo this. I'm going to start this off as Mario, and you'll see that we'll start off with Mario in the input field, and that's because it's bound from here to here, as well as from here to here. So we will be using vModel an awful lot as we go through the rest of the course, as we work with forms in numerous different projects. Alright, so we've seen how we can use vModel to track what a user types into these different input fields, and then we store those in these data properties. But we can use vModel with other form fields as well, not just inputs like this. And one of those form fields is a select box. So let's give this a whirl. Let's create a label for this first, get rid of the for attribute, and this is going to be for the role, and that would be their job role, and it could either be a web designer or a web developer. So let's do a select box for this. We don't need the name or the ID attribute, we're not going to be using those, and inside the select box we need a couple of options. Now the value of the first option could be developer, and what a user sees would be web developer. Let's do another, and this time it's going to be for designer, and this would be web designer. Let me just spell this correctly, developer. Okay, so now if we take a look at this, a user has two options, web designer and web developer, and I might want to track what option a user selects. So I'm going to create another property down here, a third property, called role, and that's going to be a blank string to begin with. Then I'm going to apply a vModel to the select field itself. So v-model is equal to role, like that. And now whatever a user selects, the value of that option is going to be assigned to this right here. Now if I output this at the bottom, we should see what a user selects. So let's do role and output that variable like so, save it and come over here. If we select one of these things now, we can see update at the bottom with the value of whatever we select. So web designer is designer and web developer is developer. Now, if we refresh, we can see to begin with, no value or option is selected. If you want there to be a default option, then you need to apply a value to this to begin with. And the reason we don't see an option is because we have this binding and there is no value. So we're saying, okay, I don't want anything being selected to begin with because this is empty. Now, if I was to say in here, designer, it would mean this would be the default option to begin with. So if I save it and come over here, we can see web designer is selected. And if we refresh, it's still selected. And we can see the value down here is designer. I can still change it, that's absolutely fine. All we're doing is setting an initial value for the role up here. All right, cool. So that's how we use vModel with select fields. And again, we can also use them with other fields as well, like checkboxes. And we're going to see how to do that in the next lecture. But before we do that, I just want to make this look a little nicer. So if we go down to the CSS, the input fields have these styles. I'm also going to apply those styles to select boxes as well. Save it, and that looks a bit better. Alright then, so we've already seen how to use vModel with text inputs like this where a user types into the fields, and we've seen how to use it with select boxes. Now I'd also like to show you how to use it with checkboxes too. Now there's two different ways we can use vModel with checkboxes, and I'm going to show you both. And we'll start off with an example at the bottom of the form. So let me first create a div with a class of terms for this form field, and this is going to be for the terms and conditions like you see at the bottom of pretty much every form on the internet. And we're going to create an input field for this of type checkbox, and it's also going to be required. Now we also want a label, and I'm doing this after the input purely for stylistic reasons. So let me say inside the label, accept terms and conditions. Alright, so if we take a look at this, it will look rubbish on the page. So now I'm just going to add in a few different styles for this input field. Let me come down to the styles over here and just paste them in like so. So you can see we're targeting the input where the type is checkbox. and then we're displaying this as inline block, so it sits next to the label. Then the width is 16 pixels, bit of margin to the right but nowhere else, and the position is relative, so we can nudge it from the top by 2 pixels, and that's just so it aligns itself a little bit more with the label. So if we take a look at this now, it should look a bit better, and it does. Okay, so we want to track when a user clicks this and unclicks it. Now the way we do that is by attaching a V model to this input over here. So I'll say V model, and we need to set it equal to some kind of data property. So let's create that down here, and I'm going to call it terms, like that. Now then, this is going to be a Boolean, and when a user checks this, that Boolean will be true. When they uncheck it, it will be false. All right, so that's how we can track whether a user has clicked this input field, this checkbox. So what I'm going to do is set it to be false to begin with, then set vModel equal to this, which is terms, save it, and we won't see any significant effect. So let's add another statement at the bottom over here to say whether they have accepted the terms. Let's say terms accepted, and we're going to output the terms property. Save that and preview, and we can see down here terms accepted false, but if we click this, then it's true, and then if we unclick, it's false again. Now if you want something checked by default, you can change the initial value here from false to true, and now you can see when we first load, it's checked. Okay, now I'm going to change that back to false to begin with. So that's the first way we can work with checkboxes, by using one single checkbox with a V model, and then that will be either true or false dependent on whether it's checked or not checked. Now the second way to work with checkboxes is by using an array of values and multiple different checkboxes that belong together. So let me just do an example of this down here. I'm going to create a div, and inside that div I'm going to create another input which is a checkbox, like so, and I'm not going to say required here because I don't require a user to check it. If you have terms and conditions, generally you have to check them in order to sign up or something, so that's why that one's required, but this one here is not required, so you can leave it blank or you can check it. Now this one right here is going to have a V model equal to names. Now I need to make that property down here, names, and I'm going to set that to be an empty array to begin with. We'll find out why in a second. Now I want a label for this, so the label is going to just be a name, and that will be Sean. Alright, so I'm going to duplicate this and paste it down here a couple more times, so we have 3 checkboxes. Each time around, the V model is always going to be names for each one, and that's because I want to group these together so they all belong to the same kind of data, and this will become clear in a second. Now the label for this one is going to be Yoshi, and then for this one is going to be Mario. Now then, what happens here? Well, they're all using vModel names, and that is an array. So I want to give the user the opportunity to click as many of these as they want and uncheck as many of these as they want. And what I'd like to do is make it so the ones they check, those values, Yoshi and Mario, if we check those, would end up inside this array. Now, the way we do that is by assigning a value to each one of these checkboxes. So I could say value is equal to Sean for this one, much like the label. The value for this one will be Yoshi. The value for the last one is Mario. So now, because they're all connected to the same data, they all use the same data property, this time it can't be a Boolean, because when would it be true and when would it be false? If we click this one but not the other two, would that be true or false? Doesn't make sense. So when we use multiple input fields that are of type checkbox that all have the same vModel data property, then instead we use an array. And then whichever one of these are checked, the value of those goes into the array. So if we check this one and this one, then the array will contain Sean and Yoshi, the ones we checked. Make sense? So they're the 2 different ways we can work with checkboxes, either with Booleans for a single checkbox or with arrays of data using multiple checkboxes that belong together. So let's just output those at the bottom. I'm going to say down here, paragraph tag and names, and I'll output the names there. So let me save this. Scroll down here, we can see it's empty to begin with. If we click Sean, Sean's added to it. If we click Mario, that's added to it, Yoshi. And if we uncheck one, then it takes it out of the array. Okay, so there we go. There's the two different ways we can work with checkboxes. Now, I'm actually going to delete this one right here because we don't need it for this form. I just wanted to show you that we can do that, and we might use it later in the course as well. I'm going to get rid of names down here as well, and names down here, so that we're just left with that one single checkbox at the bottom of our form to accept the terms and conditions. Alright then, so what I'd like to do now is add in another input field below the role whereby a user can enter in their skills. For example, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, Photoshop, hopefully Vue.js by now. And then for each of those skills, I'd like to take it and add it to an array, which we can then store in our component data down here. So we're keeping track of all the skills a user has. So in order to do this, we're going to have to learn about keyboard events, which include things like key up, key press, key down, and also keyboard event modifiers. Now these work in a very similar way to mouse event modifiers that we saw before. It's just that this is for keyboards. So now what I'm going to do is first of all create that input field above the terms but below the role. We need a label, and that label is going to say skills. And then below that I'm going to create an input field, and the type of input field is text. Now then, I'm also going to apply a vModel to this, and I'm going to call this temp skill. And the reason I'm going to call it temp skill is because every time a user adds in a new skill and then presses a certain key, I'm going to take that temp skill and add it to a skills array, and then we will clear the temp skill so a user can add in another one. So it's always just a temporary skill. Okay, so let's create that down here now. Temp skill, like so, and that's going to be just an empty string to begin with. Now I also, like I said, want to store all the skills inside an array. So first of all, how are we going to do this? Well, if we come over here and take a look at this, if I type in HTML, that's being stored in the temp skill property. Now what I'd like to do is listen for a keyboard event, and that is going to be a key up event. So that when a user presses a certain key, for example, the comma, but it could be any other key that you want, I want to take what they've typed before the comma and I want to add it to the skills array. And at that point, I then want to clear this field so they can add another skill like CSS. Then if they type comma again, I want to take the text again they've typed and add it to the skills array and then clear it. So I need to listen for that key up event or key press event, whichever you prefer, for the comma. And then when it is a comma, that's the signal that I need to take what a user types and put it into the skills array. So that's what we're going to do. So first of all, we need to listen for this event. Now there's many different types of keyboard events. So you could use over here, if we say at, because it is an event, and then we could use key press, or we could use key down, or we could use key up, which is what I'm going to use. And then this fires every time a user presses a key and then lifts it up. So I want to fire a function when this happens. So add skill is going to be the name of that function. Now we need to create that down here inside the methods property. So add skill. Now I also want to take in the event object into this function, which remember we get automatically whenever an event fires in Vue. So let's log that to the console to see what it looks like. And if I come over here now, whenever I press any key, when that key comes up, the event object is going to be logged over here. So I could press K and we see that event object and we can see the key was K. So I can also press comma and we can see the key is comma. Now that is the event that I want to listen for when the key is equal to a comma. So let's check that first of all down here, because remember, I only want to add that skill that a user types into the input field when a user presses comma. So I'm going to say if, first of all, and then I'll take the event e.key is triple equal to a comma when that is true, but also I want there to be a value inside temp skill. So if they just type in, for example, nothing but a comma, then I don't want this to fire because they've not typed anything before it. So let's say, and we have this .temp skill, meaning that has a value. If this was an empty string still, then this would be false, and then whatever code we place inside this if block would not fire. So this is only going to fire if we press comma and we have a value before the comma for the temp skill. All right. So then what I'd like to do now is I'd like to take whatever the temp skill is and add it to this skills array. So let me do that. I'm going to say this dot skills and then dot push and then this dot temp skill, like so. So now then, every time we press a comma, it's going to add whatever is in the input field to the skills array right here. Now, after that is done, I want to take this .temp skill, like so, and I want to set it equal to an empty string again, because then it will clear the input field, so we can add a new one. So now let's try outputting this, but instead of outputting it right here at the bottom, I'm going to cycle through them underneath this input field and output them right here. So to do that, I'm going to say div, and then I'm going to say v4, which we have seen already to cycle through something, and that is going to be equal to skill in skills. Skills is what we're cycling through. Now inside this, I'm going to output the skill. Before we do that though, notice we have an error, and if we hover over, it says we need a key on this thing, and that is so that Vue can keep track of the different elements in this list. So whenever we use v4, we should always have a key property, and that should be unique for each skill. So do we have anything inside the skills array which is unique? Well, the skill itself. So we can just bind by using a colon the skill, like so, and that is going to be unique for every skill as we cycle through them. They might add in the same skill twice, but we'll sort that out later on. For now, I'm also going to give this a class of pill, so we can style it a bit later on. And inside the div, I'm just going to output the skill. So I'll say skill like so. Remember, we have access to that individual skill as we cycle through them. So let's save this and preview over here. And if we type something in, I'm going to clear this. If we type in HTML and then press comma, notice this goes down here. We see the comma as well, which we will sort out shortly, but we see that. Now, if I type in CSS and press comma, that's added. Okay, so there's two problems. The first problem is that we see the comma over here, and the second problem is that I can add in duplicate values. So I could type in HTML and press comma, and that would now appear twice, and I don't want this to be the case because of two reasons. First of all, the key is not going to be the same for each div, and when we use Vue, it must be that the key is always unique. If you don't do this, then you might have unexpected behavior later on. So that must always be unique. The second reason that this is a problem is just that we don't want them to be twice. That makes no sense. We just want one skill to appear once in the list. So the way we're going to solve this problem is by first of all coming down to this if check right here, and inside that if check I want to make sure that the temp skill is not already inside the skills array. So let me do an if check here to do that. I'll say if, and then I'm going to say this dot skills dot includes, which is an array method, and then this dot temp skill. Okay, so let me just open this up and explain it. This right here will check to see if the skills array already includes the temp skill which we're trying to add to it. Now, if it does include that, this is going to be true. Now, I only want to fire this code if it doesn't include that. So I need to negate this. And now, if it doesn't include this, it's going to be true because of this. And therefore, we can add the temp skill. So let me take this and place it inside here. So now we can add duplicate skills. So if I save this and test it, let me come over here, HTML, press comma, and it adds it, CSS, that's fine. If I try to add in HTML again and press comma, we don't get it anymore. It still clears it because we still clear it right here outside of this if block, but it only adds it in if it's not already included in the skills array. So that's the first problem solved. The second problem is that this thing right here is being added to the skills array as well, and we don't want that. So the way we can get around this is to add an event modifier to this thing over here. So if I say .alt, it means that the Alt key must also be pressed. And if we hold down the Alt key as well as pressing another key, the value of that other key won't actually appear inside the input. Let me demo that. If I type in S, it appears there. If I type Alt S, we don't see that, but the keyboard event still happens. So if I refresh so we can clear this, I'm going to type in HTML and then I'm going to say Alt, comma. And notice it still fires the event, but we don't actually get the comma now. So that's why I used this Alt event modifier right here. So I know there was quite a lot to take in that video, but hopefully now you understand the two main concepts that we've gone through here. First of all, we have a keyboard event, key up, that fires a function every time there is a key up event inside this input field. And then we fire this add skill function. Inside that, we take in the event object and we check the key. And if it was a comma, and if this .temp skill has a value, if the user's typed something into the input field, at that point, we check the current skills. If the current skills does not already include the temp skill, what they've typed in right here, at that point, if it doesn't include it, we add that skill to the skills array. And then we clear out the temp skill, so a user can add in another one. Now, we add on the Alt event modifier right here, so that the comma doesn't actually get displayed inside the skills array. It still fires the event, and it still recognizes that it was the comma key that was pressed, but it doesn't display that because when we hold Alt and a key, it doesn't show that key in the input. Okay? So there we go. That is keyboard events, and that is keyboard event modifiers. And again, we probably will use these more as we go forward. Alright then, so time for another challenge, and this time around I want you to be able to attach a click event to each skill that we output so that when a user clicks on one of those skills, we delete it from the skills array down here. So when we click on Photoshop, for example, delete that from the skills array and it will no longer show over here. So before we do that, I'm just going to add some styles to these things right here because currently they look pants and I want them to look a bit better. So to do that, I'm using the pill class where we output each skill. So down here in the styles, I'm just going to paste these in and walk you through them. We display them as inline blocks so they sit next to each other, give them a bit of margin and padding, a background of a very light grey, a border radius to make them rounded at the corners, font size of 12, that reduces it, letter spacing of 1 pixel, we make them bold, the colour of the text is a deepish kind of grey, and then the cursor is pointer so we know that we can click them. So if I save this and preview, we can see they look like this now. So hit pause now and give this a try, and then if you start to struggle or you just want to see my solution, hit play again and I'm going to show you how to do it. So the first step in all of this is attaching a click event to each one of these skills. So over in the code, I'm going to come to this loop, and then where we have this skill, I'm going to cut that, create a span tag to surround it, and then attach a click event to the span tag. Now, you don't need to use a span tag. You can choose whatever you want to attach the click event to. It really doesn't matter. I'm going to set this equal to a function called delete skill. Now, let's create that function down here in the methods. So after add skill, we want delete skill as well. Now, inside here, we want to delete a specific skill, but we need to know what skill we want to delete. So let's pass it into this function as an argument. Now, remember, we have access to each individual skill because we're in a v-for loop, and we can use that right here. We can pass it in as an argument. So that is the skill that we want to delete. So down here, we can take in that skill, and then we need to figure out a way to remove it from the skills array. And to do this, we're going to use the filter method on the array. So I'm going to say this.skills is equal to a new value because we're updating it, and we're going to set that equal to this.skills.filter. Now remember, the filter method cycles through an array and fires a function for each item in the array. If we return true for an item in the array, then we keep it in the array. If we return false, we remove it from the array. So let's fire this function for each item, and inside this function, we take the item that we're currently iterating. So all I want to do is check, does the skill that we take in right here equal to the item? Because if it does, then we want to return false because we want to remove that skill. So let's return skill is not equal to item. So if they're not equal, it returns true and that item remains in the array. If they are equal, if the skill we clicked on and pass into the function matches the item that we're currently iterating, then we want to remove it. So if they are equal, this will be false, and therefore, since we're returning false for that item, it filters it out of the array. It removes it. This returns the filtered array, which is then assigned to the skills property. So we're updating the skills property with that filtered array. So let's give this a whirl, check this out, add a couple of skills, HTML and CSS and Photoshop. That will do. Click on one of these and it deletes it. Awesome. Alright then, so the last thing I want to show you in this chapter is how to submit this form and then also how to react to that submit event when it occurs. Now in practice, if you create a real project, then what you do at this point is to take all of that data on submission and send it to a database maybe to save. But since we've not worked with databases yet, we're not going to do that. And instead what we'll do is maybe just a bit of custom validation for the password field to make sure it's long enough. And then we could output an error if it's not long enough. And then also with the rest of the data, just log it to the console. So I just want to show you the basics of how to set up this submit event and handle it. So to begin with, we need to create a button at the bottom of the form. Let's do that. And I'm going to surround this button in a div with a class of submit. And the only reason I'm doing this is so I can apply some CSS styles to it in a minute. Inside that we need a button, and I'm going to say create an account inside it. Now if we take a look at this, it probably looks pants. Yes, it does. So let's apply some styles to it. I'm just going to paste these at the bottom of the style tag, and I got these from my repo, which you can get as well. The background of the button is going to be blue, no border, a bit of padding and margin to the top. The colour of the text is white and the border radius is 20 pixels to soften up the corners. The submit div that surrounds the button says text align is centre, and that's so the button inside it will be aligned in the centre of the form. So let's save that and preview, and that looks a lot better. Now, whenever we have a button inside a form, if we were to click on that button, it would fire a submit event on the form. That is the normal behavior of HTML forms, nothing to do with Vue whatsoever. So if I was to enter in a load of junk in here, just so we can test this out and accept the terms and conditions, if I click create an account, that would fire a submit event. So check this out. The normal behavior in HTML is to refresh the page when that happens. And since it refreshes, these go back to blank fields. So instead of this, what I'd like to do is react to this submit event in Vue and override that default behavior so that I can do something different. So the way I'm going to do this is by attaching a submit event to the form. Now you might be thinking, why not just attach a click event to the button? And you could do that, but the actual event that occurs is the form being submitted. So I'm going to use that submit event instead. So we can take our form right here and we can attach a submit event to it, much like we attach events to other things using the @ symbol. So I'll say @submit and set it equal to a function. I'm going to call this function handle submit, but you can call it what you want, it really doesn't matter. And we need to create that function down at the bottom over here inside methods, handle submit. Now if we wanted to, we could take in the event object, but I don't need it, so I won't do. Now I'm going to console.log over here, form submitted, so we can see when this happens. Now there is still a problem with this. And the problem is that we're still not overriding the default behavior of the browser. Yes, we're saying we want to fire a function when the form is submitted, but we're not telling the form that, look, I want you to prevent the default action of refreshing the page when you're submitted. And I'll demo that. If we open up the console over here and clear that, I'm going to type in a load of stuff just to test this, password, and then accept the terms. Notice the log will flash up very quickly over here, but then the page will refresh. Create an account, and we saw that message very quickly before the page refreshed. So it's firing this function, which is good, but we still need to say, look, prevent the default action of the form being submitted. Do not reload the page. And the way we do that in Vue is by attaching an event modifier to the submit event. That event modifier is prevent, and that prevents the default action of the form being submitted. So now if I try this, I'm going to come over here again and enter in a load of different details like so. And then down here, create an account, and we see form submitted and the page does not reload. So that's what we need to do. Now, like I said, normally inside this function down here, what we do is we check all the data that we have on the user that they've entered and then submit it to a database. We're not going to do that because we've not worked with databases yet. Instead, what I'm going to do now is a little bit of validation to check the password field and also just log all the details out to the console. So then let's get rid of this, and first of all let's do a little bit of validation on the password. So validate password. So I want to check to make sure that the password length is over 5 characters. If it's not, then I'm going to create an error and output that error in the template. So first of all, I'm going to create a password error property, which I've already done right here inside our data. And that's an empty string to begin with. And if the password length is not over 5, I'm going to update this. Now I could use an if check to say, look, if this.password, which is where we're storing the password, is not over 5, then update this with an error. But instead I'm going to use a ternary operator just to be a bit different, and I'm going to say this.password error is equal to this.password.length is over 5 question mark. And then the way a ternary operator works is that we have a statement that we evaluate, and then we do a question mark, and then we have 2 values. The left value is going to be if this is true. The right value is going to be if this is false. And then whatever value we choose is assigned to the password error. So for example, if this is true and the password length is over 5, then the error is going to be just an empty string because we don't need an error. Then we do a colon and we say what will the value be if this is false. So let's say in this case, the password must be at least 6 cars long. That's all we need to do. Now I'm just going to format this a bit better by adding this to the next line so it doesn't scoot off over to the right. Okay, so now we're updating this password error based on the password length. If it's over 5, then the error is still a blank string. If it's not over 5, then the password error will become this string right here. Okay, so now what we can do is we can output this error up in the template, and we'll do that below the password field over here. Now we only want to output this error if password error has a value, so we'll say div and then v-if is equal to password error. Now that's going to be false if it's an empty string, so we won't output it then, and it's going to be true if it's not an empty string, in which case we will output it. So let's output there password error like so. And I'm also going to give this a class equal to error just so we can style it a little bit in a second. Now let's try this out. If I enter in some kind of email and then I enter in a password that's only 3 characters long and then accept, watch the error. See, password must be at least 6 characters long. If I change this to be more than 5 characters long and create an account, the error goes, because at that point down here we set the error back to an empty string. Okay, so let's just add in a little style for the error at the bottom down here. I'm going to copy this from my course files again and paste it in right at the bottom, and we can see the color is this red color. We give it a bit of margin at the top, we'll reduce the font size and make it bold. So let's just see that in action. If I reduce this to a few characters, create an account, and this is the error now. Awesome. Okay, so we've done a little bit of validation, which is what we might do inside a submit handler like this. We probably do something a little more complex than this and check the other fields as well. But this is just an example of what we can do inside this handler. So now what I'd like to do is gather up all of the information and output it to the console. But I only want to do this if there's not an error. So let's say if, and then we need exclamation mark, this.password error. So this is only going to fire code if there is no error, because we have this in front of it. And inside here, I'm just going to log out all of the different values that we have. So I'm going to paste these logs in so you don't have to watch me type it out. So we're outputting the email, the password, the role, the skills, and the terms. So let's check this out and make sure everything works. Add in an email. I'm going to say mario@yahoo.co.uk. Password, load of old characters, don't know what I'm typing. And then we'll say web developer skills, HTML, and CSS, and Vue. And then let's accept the terms and create an account. And we see all of this information over here. Awesome. Now, like I said, in the future, we will take all of this information and probably do something like send it to a database or use an authentication service to sign that user up. But for now, this will do. I just wanted to show you how to use forms in Vue.js. Now, so far in all of the Vue applications we've created, we've only ever worked with one page, a home page. And in that homepage route, we've added multiple different components that are all nested inside the root app component. That's what we've been doing so far. But at some point, you'll want to make a Vue website with multiple different pages or routes. For example, an about page, or a blogs page, or a contact page. So how does that work with Vue applications? Well, first of all, remember, we talked about Vue allowing us to create single page applications at the start of the course. And by that, I don't mean there's only ever one page that we see in a browser. I mean that there's only ever one HTML page sent back to us, to the browser from the server. And after that's sent to the browser, Vue takes control and handles all of the pages and the routing from the browser itself. We never need to send another request to the server for more pages. Vue just switches out the components for different routes when needed. For example, say we make an initial request by typing into the address bar mysite.com and we send that request to the server. Then the server sends back an empty HTML document along with the Vue JavaScript bundle. Now Vue then mounts our Vue app to the DOM, the HTML page, so it takes the root app component and injects it into the HTML page. That's exactly what we've seen so far. But when we also work with routing and the Vue router and pages in Vue, it takes one extra step. It looks at the route that we're currently on in the browser, and then it decides what component to nest inside the app component dependent on that route. For example, in this case, it will see the base route just / because we've just gone to mysite.com. And in that case, it might nest a home component inside the root app component. Now, if our initial request to the server was something else, like / contact, instead it would nest a contact component inside the browser initially instead. Now, thereafter, when we click links around the website, we don't send any more requests to the server. Instead, Vue intercepts the requests and looks at the route of the link we clicked. For example, it could be going to / about. So it would unmount the current route component and instead nest an about component. It's really simple to set up, and once you get the hang of it, it will become second nature, and I'm going to show you how to set it up next. So in order to set up routing in our Vue applications, we also need to use another separate package called the Vue router. And the Vue router package works hand in hand with the core Vue library in order to allow us to set up a routing system. So you can do this manually in existing projects. You can install the Vue router package and set it up yourself. But the easiest way to get started with this is to generate a new Vue project using the Vue CLI and have the Vue CLI set up routing for us. So that's what we're going to do. I've already navigated to the directory I want to create a new project in. Then I'm going to say Vue create and the project name, which will be ninja-jobs. So we're just going to make a small project to demo this Vue router. So press enter to generate this project. And we're going to manually select features. We're going to go down to router and press spacebar to say we want to install the Vue router and set that up as well. So the Vue CLI will then take care of all of that for us. I'm also going to unselect this and then press enter. We'll use version 3. And this right here, this asks us, do we want to use history mode for the router? Now the other mode is hash mode, where we see hashes in our different URLs. We're going to use the history mode, and this is more important later when we come to deploy the application to Firebase. So I will talk about this a little bit more then. For now, just select yes, the default option. We're going to choose default config file, and we don't want to save this as a preset, and then this will generate our Vue application for us. Okay then, so once that's done, like always, I'm going to cd into the new project directory, Ninja Jobs in this case, press enter, and then I'll type code, space, and then full stop, press enter to open it up in Visual Studio Code. And this is what the starter project looks like when we use the Vue router. So the first thing I want to show you inside this new boilerplate project is the package.json file, because we now have a new dependency. This is the Vue router package that is now installed into this project, and therefore we can use it to generate different routes. So that's the first difference. The second difference is inside the source folder. You see now we have this router folder, and inside that an index file. That wasn't there before. And this is where we set up all of our different routes. So you can see right here we have a routes array, and this array contains different objects, and each object represents a single route. So each route object has these three different properties. We have the path property, which is the URL path relative to the root of the site. So in this case, just /. We have a name property, which is a name of the route, kind of like an identifier. We also have the component that we want to use when a user goes to this route, and in this case it's the home component, and that is being imported at the top. So that is a single route object. We also have another down here. The path is /about, the name is about, and this right here is showing you how to lazy load routes. I don't want you to worry about that for now. We'll talk about that later. For now, let's just register the component for this route, which is about. But that does mean we have to import it at the top now. So let's change home to about. And now we have those components. I will talk about these later on, but for now, we have our array now of different routes. But at the minute, that is just an array and it's not really doing anything. At the bottom of this file is where we actually set up the router instance. Now this is the thing that actually creates our router for the app, and this function right here is being imported at the top from the Vue router package. Now inside that we pass an object with a couple of different properties. The first one is the history property. Now this function right here, create web history, is saying use the web history API in the browser so that we can click forward and back in our browser to go to previous routes. There's also a web hash history mode which places hashes in the URLs, but we're going to stick with this one. Now inside this method, inside this function, we also pass in the base URL of our project. Now 99% of the time you don't need to change any of the setup inside this router, but we will be changing our routes as we go forward. Now the second property it passes in is the route itself, and that's so our router is aware of the routes that we're using and it can register them. And then finally we export the router at the bottom. So whenever you want to create a new route, all you need to do is add a new object into this routes array. So this router now that we export at the bottom is being used inside the main.js file where we kickstart the app. And we're still using create app to create an application and pass in the root component, the app, and we still mount it to the DOM in the same location. But this time between those two steps, we use this method, use. And this use method takes in an argument, which is the router that we exported over here. So it imports that from that file. And by the way, we don't need /index over here to import that. When you go to a folder and it contains an index file, it will automatically import the index when you use the folder name. So we import that and we register it for the app right here. So now our application uses the router. Now that's what we're doing with the router object. But when we come to actually use our routes in the template, how do we set it up? Well, if we go to app.vue, the root component, and take a look inside the template, we can see this router view tag right here. So this is a Vue router special tag that we can use without having to import anything. And right here, where this tag is, that is where our route components will be dynamically injected dependent on the route that we visit. So if I go to /, according to this, then I will get the home component, and that home component will be rendered right here where the router view tag is. If I go to /about, then instead I will get the about component, and that will be rendered right here. So that's how we use our routes in the template, and we only really need to nest this in the root component, and then whatever route we go to, the component for that route will be injected right here. Now, alongside that, we have a nav, and we could have something else like a footer below this as well. Anything else around it, that will all appear on every single page because it's not where the router view is, it's around it. It's only the different route components that will change when we go to different routes. Now, notice also this views folder right here. Now, this is where all of our different route components live. In our case, the home component and the about component. So if we were to go to /about, because we registered inside the route file over here, /about, to use the about component, it will show this about component inside the views folder right here where the router view tag is. Now, we'll talk more about folder structure later on in the course, so don't worry too much about that for now. But we know now that our different route components are shown here. So I'm going to test all of this out in the browser. Let me save this file, open up a terminal, and then I'm going to say npm run serve. Then I'm going to control click that to open it up in a browser, and we can see it right here. So you can see we have this nav at the top, and if we go to this and click on this, it goes to /about, and it loads in the about component. If we click on this, it goes back to the home page. So notice how quick all of this is. It loads these different routes really quickly, and we can also see the route change up in the address bar right here. Now, the reason it loads really quickly is because Vue is only switching out the components for different routes. A new request is not being sent to the server for every new page every time we click on one of these links. Remember, when we first make a request to the server, it responds with just the bare bones index.html file and the bundled Vue JavaScript code. Whatever the first request route is, Vue will look at that and inject the correct components for that route into the app.vue file. For example, if the initial request is /about, if we hit enter, it sends back that blank HTML page. Vue will look at the route and it will inject the about component because of this route here into the app.vue root component where the router view tag is. Now, thereafter, anytime we navigate around the website by clicking these different links, Vue is going to intercept the request for the new route, and then it will look at that requested route and swap in the relevant components into the app.vue file. So all of the routing is done in the client in the browser, and the requests for new pages are not sent to the server. And this is what makes the app much faster and slicker. Now, the way Vue does this, intercepting new page requests, is by using a special tag called a router link, which if we minimize this, we can see right here, and we'll talk more about those in the next lecture. Okay then, so we've seen how when we click on these links, Vue intercepts the requests to get those new routes, and it just replaces the component for the page really quickly, and that happens where this router view tag is. Now, the reason it can intercept those requests is because we're using a special tag, and that is a Vue tag called router link. We're not using anchor tags right here. Now, this router link tag has a to attribute to say where we want to go to, and that is the path. And that's a bit like the href in an anchor tag. Then we have some text, and then we close off the router link. So this is the reason that Vue can intercept those requests, because we use these special tags with that behavior built into it. If we were to use an anchor tag instead and say the href was /about, for example, we'll say about right here, then this wouldn't work the same way, because this would just send a fresh request to the server and Vue would not intercept it because it doesn't have that behavior built into it. This one has that behavior of intercepting the request built into it. I can demo this. Let me come to the browser and open up the network tab, choose network, and this is going to show any network requests. Now, if I click on home, we don't see a network request for another HTML page, only for the logo. If I go to about, we don't see a new one, and I can go back and forth, and we only see network requests for this image right here, not new pages. Now then, if I click on this about one right here, notice we get all these new requests. One of them is going to be for an HTML page. One of them is going to be for app.js and other things as well. So Vue is not intercepting this thing, and that is why we use router links instead. That is much faster, and it just changes the component rather than going to send a new request to the server. Now, as well as intercepting these requests, there's also other benefits to using router links as well. First of all, let me save this and head to the browser, and I'm going to go to Elements over here so we can see, and I'm going to inspect this one. And notice, by the way, when it renders to the DOM, it is still just an anchor tag, but it has that built-in functionality under the hood. Now, notice when we click on one of these, the active one becomes green, and that's because they get these classes automatically. You can see router link active and router link exact active. Okay, so we can style active classes or active links easily as well, and those styles are applied right here. Now I'm just going to change this a little bit just to customize it, and I'm going to say that the color of these should be white, and instead I'm going to apply a background of crimson like so. Save that and preview, and now we can see that is the style of an active link. I also want to change this style a little bit as well. So nav A, we're going to say text decoration is none to remove the underlining, and then give it a bit of padding, 10 pixels, and then we'll also, oops, let me just change that to a colon. We'll also say border radius is 4 pixels to soften the corners. Check this out again, and cool, that looks pretty nice. So that is just another benefit of using router links. Now, another benefit of using these router links is that we can data bind to this to attribute right here. So I could say :2, and then instead of hard coding the path right here, I could pass in an object which represents this route. And then I could say the name of the route I want to go to is about. Now, this is going to work exactly the same way because it's going to look at this object and see that the name is about. And if we take a look at our router file, we have a name property right here. So it matches against whatever name we place here, and it uses that component. So what's the benefit of this? It works the same way, and I'm going to show you this. If I click these, it still works the same way. But what's the benefit of using this? Well, if you think about it, your routes, your paths might actually change over time. For example, you might decide in the future, well, actually, it's not going to be about, it's going to be about us. Now, if that was the case, you'd have to go through the rest of your website and update all of your router links if you coded them to /about, and you'd update them to about us. But if you don't use that way and you instead use this way of passing through an object and data binding to the to attribute, you don't need to change a thing because it's still called the same name over here. It's still called about. It doesn't matter that this is changed because we're using the name instead now. So that's another way of using a router links. And for the most part, we'll be using this in the future for our projects. Alright then, so there's one more thing I want to do in this lecture, and that's just to remove any content that we don't really need for this project. So I'm going to go to the home component first of all, and I'm going to delete the hello world component. We don't need that, and in fact we can go into components and delete that as well because we won't be using it. And inside this div at the top, we can just do an h1 to say homepage, and then below that I'm going to do some lorem ipsum, so paragraph tag. Then I'll say lorem and how many words I want, 100. Press tab to create that, and then duplicate it. So we've got a couple of paragraphs right here of lorem ipsum. We can also remove hello world from the components right here. Okay, so that's the home page. And if we go to the about page, I'm just going to add some lorem ipsum right here as well. Lorem 100, tab, and duplicate. Save that, and let's view this in a browser. Over here we have the home and we have about. Now it's not picking up the change in content, so I'm going to hard refresh this page, and now we see it. And finally, I'm just going to change the URL back to about because I don't want it to be about us. So let's do that. Save it, and that's pretty much everything for now. So next up, I'm going to talk a little bit more about folder structure and this views folder right here. In this lecture, I just want to take a few minutes to talk about folder and file structure and how you would organize your different components in these folders in a Vue application, because there's many different ways you can do this, and how you structure your different folders and files is entirely up to you. I would just always make sure it's constant and logical. Now, for smaller projects with just a handful of pages, I would tend to stick to this default setup where all of my route components are inside this views folder. So if I had another page, like a contact page, I would make a contact view file inside the views folder for it. Now, sometimes I'd also create subfolders for different pages as well to group route components or subcomponents together where needed. For example, if I had a page which was a list of jobs, then I might create a jobs component first of all, like this. And let's just flesh out this component, and inside the object down here we'll have some data, and inside the data we need to return an object, and I'm going to create a jobs property which is an array of data. Now I'm just going to paste in 3 objects here. So we have a job title for each one, an ID, and some details which are not very descriptive in this case, but we have some data, and let's say we want to cycle through that data now. First of all, let's do an H1 to say jobs, and then under that I'm going to cycle through the data with a div, and I'm going to say v-4 on this div, and we're cycling through the jobs, so I'll call each individual job a job and say in jobs. Remember, when we use v4, we need a key property which must be unique for each job, and that's why I created this ID property right here. So we'll set it equal to job.id. We have access to job because we have it right here, and then inside that all I'm going to do is output the job title inside an H2, so job.title. Alright, so we have this component for the jobs page. We'd also need to register that route. So let's do that over here inside the, oops, not that one, the index.js file. At the bottom, I'm going to create another object, and I will say path is /jobs, and the name of this component is going to be jobs, and the component we use is going to be jobs. And we also need to import that at the top. So let me duplicate this and change about to jobs like so. Now, if I save this and go to /jobs, I'm going to get this jobs component. Before I do that, I'm going to go to the app component over here, and I want to add now another link in the nav to go to the jobs page. So let me come down here and do another router link like so, and then I need to bind to the to attribute and set it equal to an object, because we're going to use this structure right here instead of using the path. And the name of the route is jobs. That's what I called it inside this file right here. So I want this to say jobs, and then we need to close off that router link as well. Okay, so if I save this and preview, we can see we have jobs over here as well. And if I click on this, we see all of those jobs. So all of that is working. But now let's get back to the folder structure. So imagine if we were to click on one of these jobs on the page, then we might link to a job details route, which would show a job details component, and that would list details of that particular job. So we need a job details component, right? So we could create that in here like this, job details.view. Now it's at this point I might consider creating a subfolder inside views, because this job details component and this jobs component, they're kind of related. They use the same data, and they're going to be in the same kind of area on the website when it comes to URL structure. So I would probably create a new folder and call that jobs, and then I would place jobs.view in there and job details in there. Now notice when I did that, I get an error over here because it's not found that component inside the route file. And that's because we're trying to import it from the top level of views. So we need to change this as well. So jobs and then /jobs.view. And if we save that, now it should work. So this just makes our folder structure a little bit more organized, especially for larger sites with many different components and views. And this is the structure I'm mainly going to be using for routes or view components in the rest of this course. Also, I'll be using the components folder up here for any reusable components that can be nested into our view components. Now, these would be for things like modules or custom button components that we make, or maybe a card component, or anything else which really isn't page specific. It doesn't belong to a specific page, and it can be used in a number of different views. So all those kind of reusable components will be going inside there. And again, it may be at some point that we have subfolders for certain types of reusable components inside here as well. So that's it as far as folder structure goes. We'll talk more about the route for the job details right here in the next lecture. So we have a jobs page and jobs component now, which lists all the jobs. And I'd like to be able to click on a job to see a details page for that job. Now we've already made a jobs details component, so we should show this component for that page and that route. And so for each of these jobs that we output inside the jobs component right here, each of those should be inside a router link to a job details route. But what would the route for the job details page look like? Well, normally it would follow this kind of structure: /jobs / the ID, where the ID is some kind of identifier of the job that we want to see the details of. For example, it could be /123 after jobs, or /567, where this number is the ID of the job that we want to see. Or it could be something like /web dev job 231, where this would be the ID, or as it's otherwise known, the slug. So the last part of the route would be changeable, but it would always represent the ID of the job that we want to see. And then we'd show the details of that job in the details component, or the job details component in our case. Now, this changeable part of the route is known as a route parameter, and in Vue, we denote route parameters with a colon and then the parameter name. Now, the parameter name can be whatever you want, but a lot of the time you'll see it called ID. So let's see now how to set up route parameters in our application. The first thing we need to do is add in a route for the job details page. So I'm doing that inside the router index file. Inside the routes array at the bottom, create another object for this route. The path is going to be /jobs, and then it's / the route parameter, which I'm going to call ID. Now, to create a route parameter, we do a colon, then the parameter name, whatever you want to call it. In our case, it's going to be ID. Then we need a name property, and this is going to be job details. And typically when I create a name, it's always the same as the component name, most of the time anyway. And then we need a component, and for that it's the job details component. We need to also import that, so let me Alt-Shift and press down to duplicate this and change this and this to job details. Okay, so now if we save that and go to this route, no matter what the ID is, it could be 1, it could be 10, it could be Yoshi, it doesn't matter, it's going to show this component. So let's go inside this component and flesh it out a little bit. All I'm going to do for now is an H1, which says job details page, like so that we know we've landed on it. So if we go to /jobs /1, we should see the job details page, which we do. Now this up here can be anything. It can be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we still get the job details page, or it could be Mario, and we get the job details page. It doesn't matter what this value is. Vue recognizes that it follows the same structure as this route down here, where the thing after the job is changeable, because we said it can be right here, because this is a route parameter, okay? Now, it would be nice if that we could access whatever that parameter is right here inside the job details component, because ultimately we want to show details about that particular job. So we need the ID. So to access that, we can use the route object. So let me do a paragraph tag down here first of all, and I will say the job ID is, and we're going to output a dynamic value, so curly braces, and we can say in here, we want to use the route object So it's $route. And this object contains information about the current route, including any route parameters, like this. So I could say dot params to get the route parameters, but then I also need to say dot whatever the route parameter is called. In our case, it's ID. So it would be dot ID. But if the parameter was called something else, like slug, we would say dot slug here. So it's whatever the route parameter is called for that route. Okay? So let's save it. Hopefully now, when we go to this route, we're going to see the actual route parameter or the ID of that job on the page. So let me refresh, and we can see already the job ID is Mario. If I change this to 123, the job ID is 123. Now we can also access this route object right here inside the component object as well. So let me do that. I'm going to set up our data function, which returns an object, and inside here I'm going to say I want an ID property to store the ID of the current job. So we're going to get that from the route object, only this time when we're inside the component object we have to say this to reference the component object first, much like we do for data when we say this dot whatever the data property is. We don't need to say this inside the template, but we always do inside the object of the component. So we say this dot $route, and then dot params, and then dot ID. So I can now just output ID right here to grab this property, which is the ID from the route parameters. Save that, and it's going to do exactly the same thing. Refresh, change this, and we see we get the ID right here. So next up, we're going to look at how to make dynamic router links which can pass route parameters, so that when we click on one of these jobs, it goes to the correct URL at the top. For example, this one /1, for the next one /2, etc. Alright then, so I'd like to make it so that whenever we click on one of these jobs, it then redirects us to the URL for that job, and it's going to be /jobs/ the ID of that particular job. So then we can see eventually the details of that job in the job details component. So we're going to have to make up this route inside the jobs component where we output the H2. So I'm going to surround that in a router link. So let me cut this first of all, and then create a router link tag like so, and we're going to close that off as well. And then inside this I can place the H2 again. Now we need a to attribute which is equal to something, and we're going to use the object inside here. So we'll data bind so we can use an object, and the object has a name property. That's the name of the route we're going to, and that, remember, is jobDetails, and remember the name is right here. So we're going to that route, but we also want to pass through a route parameter. That is the ID of the current job that we're iterating in this v4. Now we can add parameters just by saying params, and that is an object of key value pairs, and each key is a parameter name. So we're going to pass through a parameter which is ID, so that would be the key, and then we pass the value. Well, the ID is on the job object right here, so we can just say job, which we have access to, .id. So job.id, and that's it. That will now link to the correct route for that job. Let me save this and show you. Now we can see these are links, and if we inspect each one, we should see that the first one goes to /1, the second one goes to /2, and the third one to /3. So we did that. We passed that route parameter to the URL by using this params property. That's an object, and then each key in that object is a route parameter. We have an ID route parameter. That's what we called it right here, and we've set a value of that ID to be the ID on the current job. So I hope that makes sense. So now we're sending that in, and if we click on this, we should be able to see the job ID is 1. If we do a different one, let's refresh, the job ID is 3. So this is all working fine. We have access to the route parameter right here in the job details page, and we can use that later on. But there's one more thing I want to show you. We can attach any route parameters to the props of the component we're linking to make this a little bit easier. So for example, the route parameter that we send in here, the ID, I can accept as a prop inside job details, which is where we're linking to. So I could just say props, and then inside here we want to accept the ID prop. So this won't work straight out of the box like this. We have to do one more thing, and that is inside this route for this component, we just add on a final props property and set that equal to true. And that means we can accept any route parameters as props. And what this will do is when we link to a specific component, in our case the job details component, and we pass through a parameter, Vue will attach that parameter as a prop to that job details component. So now we can accept it as a prop, and we don't need to do this anymore to get the ID. So we could comment that out because we're now just accepting the parameter, the route parameter, as a prop. And that's allowed because we said props is true for this component route. If we didn't have this on, it wouldn't work. But since this is true, we're saying, okay, any route parameter that you send through when you link to this component, like this, attach that route parameter as a prop to the component you're linking to. So we accept it and we can output it right here. So you don't have to do this. This is just a nicer way of working with those route parameters and accepting them inside a component when we link to it. So if we take a look over here, everything's still going to work exactly the same way. We go to 1 and we see the route parameter. We go to 2, we see it right here, etc. So we'll probably see more of this kind of pattern in the future as well as we make more projects. Now, finally, I just want to style these links right here a little bit better. So let's do that inside the jobs component where we output them. I'm just going to paste in these styles. So you can see we say job h2 first of all, and I don't think we actually have a class of job anywhere. So let's add that class on. So class is equal to job right here. So we go after this class and get the h2 inside it. We say we give this a background of a very light grey colour, bit of padding, some border radius, margin top and bottom, and a max width. The cursor is pointer, so we know we can click on it, and the colour of the text is a deep grey. When we hover over the h2, the background goes a slightly darker grey, and the anchor tag is text decoration none to remove the underline. Save it, and oops, let's go back. That looks, I think, a little bit better. Awesome. So next up, I want to show you how to create a 404 page and also do redirects. So in this lecture, I want to show you two more things when it comes to the Vue router. First of all, how to do redirects, and then secondly, how to set up a catch-all route for a 404 page if they go to some kind of route that doesn't exist. So first of all, the redirects, how do we set those up? Say, for example, I want to redirect the path, all jobs, like this, to just the jobs route, because maybe it used to be all jobs, but I changed that route. So I want to redirect anyone that goes to that old URL, that old route, to the jobs component. Well, that's simple to do. We need to go to our index router file, and then down here, I'm going to do the redirect. So we'll say redirect. And at the end of the day, this is just another route object that we place inside our routes array. And when we create this, the path is going to be whatever we're redirecting from. So the old route in essence, and that would be all jobs. So imagine that's what the route used to be, but now we changed it so it's just /jobs, but we want to redirect this route now to this. All we need to do is add on a redirect property and say where we want to redirect to. So in our case, /jobs, and that's all there is to it. Now, if anyone goes to /all jobs, they'll get redirected to /jobs. So let's try this out. I'm going to press enter on this route. And in fact, let's go home first of all, and then go to all-jobs, like so. Press this, and you can see we get redirected instantly to /jobs, and we see the jobs component right here. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to show you. The next thing I wanted to show you is how to create a catch-all route for any route that doesn't exist so that we can show a 404 page. For example, if we were to go to /ABC, then at the minute all we get is a blank page with the nav at the top. Nothing here to say that this page doesn't exist, it's just blank. So we get the nav because remember the nav shows on every route regardless of the route, because inside the root component the nav is right here. It's not inside the router view. This is the only bit that changes dependent on the route. So this thing right here is not very helpful. Instead, when a user goes to a route that doesn't exist like this, I'd like to show some kind of 404 page or not found page. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a view for that. So go into views, a new file, and I'm going to call this not found, but you can call it what you want. It doesn't have to be called this. And then I'm going to boilerplate this component and create a template. So first of all, we'll do an H2 to say page, or rather we'll say 404 here, and then underneath we'll do an H3 to say page not found. Okay, so I'd like to show this component when we go to any route that doesn't exist, and in fact we don't need the script or the style, so we can get rid of those. So how do we do this? How do we implement a 404 catch-all page or route? Well, we go to our routes file, which is this thing over here, and we need to add on another route object down here. So let me do a comment to say catch-all 404, and then below that we'll do our route object, and this time the path is going to be something very specific. It's going to be / then colon to denote a route parameter, and it has to be catch-all exactly like this, camel case with a capital A, and then it looks like a function because we're using parentheses, but really this is just a regex pattern, and inside that we say dot and asterisk, and that will catch any route that is not caught by any of these other route objects. So if we try to go to something that doesn't match any of these, then this route object will catch that, and we can do something with that route. So for example, I could say go to a specific component. First of all, I'm going to give this a name though, and that will be not found, and then under that we'll say the component that we want to use is the one we just created, not found. Now we need to import that, so I'm going to just duplicate this one right here and change about to not found like so. Okay, so now if we go to any route that doesn't exist, then it's going to catch that route and we're going to show this component. So let me save this, and we can see already, we see 404 page not found. If we go to something else that doesn't exist, for example / Yoshi, we get that as well. But if we go to these current routes that do exist, we get the relevant component for those routes. Now, in a real project, you'd probably make your 404 page a little bit better than this and give the user a bit more information, maybe some links to navigate around the other parts of the website. But for now, I just wanted to demonstrate how we can serve up a 404 page using this thing right here, this catch-all regular expression. Now, when we use the Vue router in Vue applications, it uses the Web History API, and that means that we can go forward and backwards using these buttons in the browser through the history of our journey in the website, if you like. Now, we can tap into that functionality programmatically in Vue applications to send the user back a page or forward a page through the history, and also we can programmatically redirect them to another route by pushing a new item onto the history. So I'm going to show you how to do all of that now. So to demo this, I'm going to go to our root component, app.vue, and I'm going to create 3 buttons below the nav but above router view. So let me create those first of all. Button, 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 and inside the first one, we will say we want to redirect the user. And then the second one will be go back a page, and the third one will be go forward a page. So pretty self-explanatory. When they click this, I want to perform a redirect. When they click this, I want to go back a page through the history, and this one go forward a page through the history. Now we need to attach click events to each one of these and apply handlers to each one as well. So let's do that. I'm going to say @click is equal to a function. Now we've not created any of these methods yet on our component object, and in fact we don't even have a component object yet, but don't worry, we'll create those in a second. So this one will be called redirect. The next one down here, @click is equal to back, and then down here, @click is equal to, surprise, surprise, forward. Alright, so now we need to create these methods, and we need to create them inside a script tag, because we want our component object, and that goes inside a script tag. In here, we need to export default, because that's always what we do when we have a component object inside a Vue file. And then we need our methods property, where we can make these methods. The first one is called redirect, like so. And then after that, we need one called back, and then after that we need one called forward. Alright, so we have these three different functions now. I just want to preview this to see what it looks like. And yeah, they don't look great. I'm just going to apply a couple of styles to the buttons down here. So let me just paste these in. You can see dead simple. We give each one a bit of margin to the left and right, a bit of padding, no border, and a border radius. So we basically just spread these out a little bit so they look a little nicer. Alright, so then when I click on the go back one, I want to go back through the history. So let's do that one first of all. Now, the way we do this is by saying this to reference the component instance, and then we can say $router. Now, before we used $route to get the route parameter. Don't confuse these two. We use the $route to get information about the current route up here. We use the router when we want to do something like move them around, and that's what we're doing. So we use the router, and then we can use a method called go. And in here we can pass through either a minus number or a plus number. If we pass through a minus number, like -1, it means go back through the history. So let me just demonstrate this. I'm going to refresh on the home page to begin at the start over here. So we're on the home, then I'm going to go to about, then I'm going to go to jobs. Now if I click the go back button, it should go to about. And it does. And if I click it again, it should go to home. And it does. And if I try to do it again, it's going to go back to what we were on before that. So that's us going back through the history one step at a time. Now this can be any number you want, for example, -2. Now if I go forward 2, so I'm currently on home, then about, then jobs, and then if I click go back, it should go back 1, 2, back to home, like that. So this is how many steps you want to go back through the history. Now I'm just going to leave it at -1. So remember, minus is go back through the history. Now the opposite is true for forward. Again, we say this .router, and then we say .go to use the same method. This time it's a plus number. Now we don't have to write plus, we just write the number because it's automatically a plus number. So I could go forward by 1 or 2, doesn't really matter. Now if we try this out, if I say go forward, then it goes to about. If I say go forward, it goes to jobs. All right. Now, if I try to do go forward again, it's not going to go anywhere because that's as far as we got. We didn't go any further because from then we went back to. Okay. So that's go back and go forward. And we use the go method with either a minus integer or a plus integer to do that. Okay, so finally, how do we redirect a user? Well, we do this by pushing on an extra route to the history. So, for example, I can say this, and then $router again, and then .push to push on a new route. And inside this, we use an object, much like we do up here. The same kind of thing. So I could redirect them by using the name property and saying I want to go to the home component. Now that is the name of this route right here. Okay, so we get redirected to that route. So if I save this now, I'm on jobs. If I click on redirect, it goes home, and I can go back again to go back to jobs. So that's how we programmatically move a user around the website, either to redirect them to another page or to go back through the history or forwards through the history. Before we finish this chapter, I just wanted to mention one thing, and it's something we touched on very briefly, or rather kind of skipped over at the start of this chapter, and that was lazy loading components. Now, I'm not going to be using lazily loaded components in any of our projects, but I did want to mention it because in production, sometimes you might want to take this approach in order to minimize the overall bundle size of your production JavaScript. So we can do something called code splitting, whereby we only load in a component's JavaScript when we actually visit that route. And that's what we briefly saw when we first created a boilerplate Vue project with the Vue CLI, which included Vue routing. And it looked something like this. Instead of declaring the component right here and importing it, so we could comment that out right now, we could instead create a function which would fire when the user visited this route, and then that would import a specific component. In our case, it would be /views and then /about.view, and then this right here, this JavaScript would only be loaded in when a user visits that route and not initially when they first come to your website. So it kind of reduces that initial loading time. Now, like I said, I'm not going to be doing this for our projects, but I wanted to let you know what it was for and what it did, and you should read more about it on the documentation. It's very well documented, and you can see all of the different steps to take right here, but it's pretty simple. So what I will do is leave this link attached to this lecture so you can go ahead and read more about it. But like I said, we're not really going to be doing that for our projects.